Dana Tech crew and is recording. That's what I was going to let you know. So this recording and the PowerPoint will be available on the decaresfunds.org site. And we've got that information that we'll share with you as we go through the presentation. And I will go ahead and get us started. So this program is part of what I would call a series of funding opportunities. And maybe I should stop for a second in case not everybody knows who I am, but I'm Sheila Bravo. I just realized I didn't even introduce myself. Like, who is this person? I'm Sheila Bravo, and I'm CEO of Dana. And I am, along with Melissa Hopkins and the folks at the Delaware Community Foundation, the United Way of Delaware, and Philanthropy Delaware, partnered with the state of Delaware and Newcastle County to put together this program. And believe it or not, it's been over a year since we started the program, and this is the fourth and final round. So today we're going to just remind, for those of you who participated last year, we'll highlight a couple of differences in this program versus last year. And for those of you who are new, we're kind of assuming that you have not heard about it. So we wanted to make sure you get an overview as well. So to put this in perspective, back last March, Dana, DCF, Philanthropy Delaware, and the United Way, we came together and felt that by working together, we could probably be most impactful in helping the nonprofit sector during this pandemic. I think none of us expected it would go as long as we did, and we have continued to work together. Dana has been collecting information to help inform philanthropy and government. In fact, our last COVID-19 survey, which was deployed in July, still working on the report, but we did find in that survey that a lot of nonprofits were continuing to experience increased costs related to COVID-19, which was an incentive for us to do this extra round. So for those of you who participated in that survey, thank you, and know that that information really is making a difference. The program we're here to speak with you today is part of a federal allocation of funding that was distributed to the state of Delaware and Newcastle County last year. It's called fondly the CARES Act. And so we, the governor and County Administrator Matt Meyer, collectively put in $25 million to help nonprofits get relief for COVID-related expenses. And we then have partnered with them to help administrate that fund. So this is the final round of that 25 million. There's a couple million left, and we wanted to exhaust it. There's another program that President Biden and Congress approved this year, which is called the American Rescue Plan. You might have heard of it, called ARPA. That is not related to this funding. We are in conversation around how nonprofits can benefit from that program. Today, we're talking still about the CARES Act. So this program, as I mentioned, is jointly funded by the state and Newcastle County. The COVID Response Collaborative, our 4 organizations, are helping to manage it. There's 2 parts to this program. The first is operational reimbursement, and the United Way is coordinating the review and processing of that portion of the grant. And then there's a second grant, part 2 as it's called, for capacity. And this is related to increased service level expenses. And this final round will open up on Monday and is open for a month. And the Delaware Community Foundation already has the sample application as well as the sample schedules on the site. So you're able to go and take a look at that. Just an overview of the spirit of the program. We, first of all, you have to follow federal guidelines. And for those who applied last year, if you recall, the guidelines were still being shaped. So there are some things in this year that you're going to see are a little different as far as the proof and of spending that is required. And that's really because as they finished out the year last year and the auditing processes happened, there was a request for some additional documentation. So I'll take you through that. This is not a competitive process. And we did, throughout this, really wanted to keep a lens towards ensuring that this was equitable. We know that very large organizations had a lot of expenses, but we also had small organizations, and we wanted to make sure the funding could stretch to all types. We also have, again, Dana's providing free technical assistance as part of this program, and we have links that you can apply for that help. So a little bit about eligibility. One is this is for expenses from January 1 of 2021 to July 12 of 2021. The reason those dates are fixed like that is because the state of emergency ended on July 12th. And so the funding is niched into that. No 2020 expenses can be submitted for this application round because that was last year. We had a round that covered those expenses. You do still need to have been incorporated by March of 2020. You need to operate in Delaware. And unfortunately, this round continues to not include those nonprofits that were eligible for funding through the Division of Small Business. And of course, just a reminder that these expenses that you would submit for reimbursement cannot have already been covered by some other funding source. As I mentioned, unfortunately, not all nonprofits can participate. The Delaware Relief Grant Program that the Division of Small Business provided did distribute some additional funds earlier in 2021, which is the reason for that. So we are hoping that we will see some additional funding that will be coming out again to support the arts and hospitality and veteran organizations in the near future. Again, the only expenses that you can submit are things that are related to the pandemic. So anything that's not will be rejected. So what does this look like? There's up to 150,000 can be submitted. It is part one is related to the operational expenses. Part two is related to service demand and cost increases. And this is, as I said, the fourth and final round. And we are trying to review the applications as they get submitted so that if there's something missing, you have an opportunity to correct it. I will encourage you to make sure that Dana's email and the Community Foundation's email are in your safe zone, because we did have some challenges last year where we would try to reach back out to someone who submitted and they did not respond. So please make sure that our emails are not going into your junk folder. So a couple of things that are not eligible here is you cannot request funds if they've already been covered by some other source, and we've listed them here. There is a certification that you will need to sign attesting that these funds were not expended. And there is, the government and our collaborative are working together on the verification process. So let me give you some examples. The first is, here's an example of a nonprofit with about a $250,000 budget. They spent $15,000 through on operations, but they got a grant from the COVID-19 Strategic Response Fund. So they could apply for up to $5,000 in that example. Say we have a nonprofit that's providing food assistance, and they've got actually a contract, but the contract doesn't cover mileage that volunteers may have had to do because the level of delivery has increased substantially. So that's an example where you could apply in part two. So I'm going to walk you through the each schedule and the elements of the parts. And again, there's part one is pretty much the same as last year, but part two, there are some subtle differences. So we've listed here a variety of eligible expenses. I will say you can also find all of this information on the DE Cares Fund. So you don't have to write everything down. It's there for you to look at. And the application actually has a drop-down box. So it really makes it easy for you to be able to classify the expenses that you incur. But we did try and working with the state to make the eligible expenses as broad as possible, but they have to fit in these categories given the federal guidelines. What's required on the application, you're going to need to tell them when your organization was incorporated as a 501c3, your 2019 operating expense budget. You may be asking, why are you looking at 2019, one of the things we recognize is that as we moved into the new year, some organizations may have had to plan for the increased costs, but you wouldn't have had those costs if the pandemic had not taken place. So in order to create this benchmark, we're looking at your 2019 budget, because that would have been kind of the baseline expenses you incurred prior to the pandemic. Would like to know the number of employees, your NTE code, that's the category that the IRS classifies you as, arts, education, healthcare. Primary services, some organizations do provide services outside of the state of Delaware. Those expenses cannot be covered in this program. If you have it in a recent IRS tax filing, so your 2020, 2019 990 or 990 EZ, submit that. If your organization does not need to file a 990 or 990 EZ, you can submit either something from a third-party audit, or for those of you organizations that are a little new, you could submit your operations budget. They'll need to see the IRS determination letter, and you must have receipts. And when I say receipts, it's not the invoice. I think we had that question a lot last year. Folks wanted to be able to present an invoice. You can also provide the documentation that shows, for example, if you send it with a credit card, that you can show the credit card expense on the credit card statement. What are not eligible for Part 1? Here's the list. It's exactly the same as last year, other than the term of the dates that this program qualifies for. A reminder that in Part 1, you cannot get reimbursed for personnel related costs, but there is an option in Part 2, which I'll take you through. It must again be related to the state of emergency, COVID-19, and capital. Here, having to buy plexi or having to secure, dividers and things like that can be covered. But it's really important you're not requesting capital reimbursement if you can't really show that it's related to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So here's an example of Part 1, and it's the same form. I just went in and changed the date up there. But you can see that you've got to put the name of the vendor, what items were purchased, expense type, and there's a drop-down box for that. There's a drop-down for payment type, when you made the payment, how much, and then ultimately how much you paid. I know this sounds really simple, but I just got to stress it again. It's really important that the amount that is the total eligible expenses that you're putting on the form and what you've requested on the grant application must be the same. So please, it might be a good idea to have someone else just take a quick check before you send it in, because that'll save a lot of time having to try to fix it in the future. So Part 2. Part 2 was designed and recognized that some nonprofits, because of the work they do, experienced increased costs in their service levels. And so we wanted to recognize that. So this is looking at your documented increase in costs associated with perhaps increased demand, or in some cases, increased costs to provide the same service. An example is if folks were able to come into your kitchen to eat, you did not have to have takeout supplies. But in the pandemic, you couldn't use your kitchen, so you had to spend a lot of money on purchasing takeout supplies. So that incremental cost associated with the takeout supplies could be covered in this program. Similar dates as Part 1. This is also a reimbursement only. That is a change from last year. Last year, you were able to project what you think you might have incurred, but now it is only for costs incurred between January and July. For the reimbursement related to employee expense, this year you will also have to have some proof of that, and a payroll journal or the employee canceled check copies can be used to help document that. And again, we have that information on the FAQ of the DE Cares funds. There's a review committee that will just confirm that everything is meeting the federal guidelines, and then that will be submitted to the state so that they can transfer the funds to get distributed. The this part 2 is also recognizing that we still have a lot of people out there that are suffering, and a lot of nonprofits are providing that support. So it is designed to target kind of specific types of services. And here's the list. So you'll see, we, again, is similar to part 1, we tried to have the list as broad as possible. We also recognize that we can't necessarily describe every possible way in which somebody might have increased expenses. So we did try to provide some examples for you, which I'll get into later. What's required for part 2? The nice thing is if you're applying for part 1 and part 2, some of this information you only fill in once. But as you get into part 2, you are going to need to also include the explanation of what services you're actually tracking and measuring, the documentation of those increased services, and then of course the documentation for the service levels. So here's an example. Pre-pandemic nonprofit, they provided meals at their location. Now they had to switch to carry out. So here's the example I gave you. The way the service is measured is number of meals and number of miles. So you show the difference between the prior year, the budget, and the actual that you've expended. And then of course, if you had to, let's say you lost your volunteers and you had to pay someone to do that work, you can include that cost, as long as those costs were not already covered by the Paycheck Protection Program. So here's a couple scenarios. I already used the example of food, but here's one for mental health. And on average, they were serving a set number of clients, 50, but now they've had this increase of 75 per month. And so they would be able to get reimbursed for that incremental 25. Here's the example again of the meals. And so again, this would be covered in part 2. This one's kind of a subtle one. If you are an organization that transitioned from in-person programming to online programming, you are able to, you had to spend money on the technology, and you got to see more people. You can't necessarily say I served more people and therefore we can get paid more or reimbursed for those folks. You can get reimbursed for the technology component, which would be in part 1, but not a part 2 expense. Hopefully that makes sense. So here's an example of the schedule for part 2. So here you're going to see again that baseline is 2019 because that's would have been the level of operations without a pandemic in theory. What you had budgeted in 2020 and then what your actual service expenses. So again, it's recognizing that the pandemic may have changed the trajectory of the service levels and costs. And this is what we're trying to document and ensure that everything fits within the federal guidelines. The personnel schedule is fairly similar to last year. But again, the difference is that we are asking you to make sure you submit the documentation so that you can have those costs reimbursed. And a lot of these, again, are drop downs. If you look at expense category and service type, those are the drop down categories that are listed in the program. And then the non-personnel schedule, again, we can't be very prescriptive here because we're not, we have so many different ways in which we provide support as nonprofits, but you will see that the expense category, again, aligns with the scopes of the program, and then you can submit it. A couple of things that we learned last year for what makes a successful application. One is that it's clear and concise, and that the folks who are reviewing it are not going to have to ask any questions because that will delay your application process. Having those documented receipts and having them in the order of the itemization that you have on the schedule. The application requires one PDF for receipts. So if you do need some assistance in combining your PDFs, we are happy to help with that. And we ask that you really be thoughtful about keeping it within eligible expenses that you think are kind of maybes. check with us first before you put it in the application. And that way, again, your application isn't going to be sent back to you for corrections. I just can't stress again how important it is that the totals on the schedule match the request amount on the application. And we do have assistance, as I mentioned, through the DelawareCaresFunds.org. There is a contact us, and we are very thankful that we've got some grant writing consultants who've agreed to work with us again to provide that assistance. So don't be shy. We're happy to help. We want you to be successful in securing this funding. So I've put here a couple of links, the DE Cares Funds website, the email address to request support, and of course, the application. The Delaware Community Foundation has the application up. It's not open yet. That starts on Monday, but you can, if you want to take a look at the sample schedules, they have a sample of the application there. Again, we're trying to give you as much information to help you be successful. And the good news is that you have a whole month to pull everything together. So that for me was important, because I know that getting this information can be time consuming. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions, because I know I did go through that fairly quickly and it's detailed. So you can either put your questions in the chat box or there's a lot of you here, so we can attempt to do the raising of hands, but I'll stop and see if anybody's got a question.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, Sheila.
Ask your questions, because if you have them, someone else probably does.
Hi, Bob.
Yeah, it's Bob Wasserbach. I do have a question. You said at the beginning it's for costs incurred between January 1st, 2021 to July 12th, 2021, correct?
Yes.
So I guess I'm a little bit confused. On the part 2, you had a slide that was comparing service levels from 2019 to 2020. But
yeah, so
those costs have to be in fiscal year 2021. So I'm a little bit confused on that.
Yeah, so again, the reason why you see 2019 is that's considered the baseline level of services. So if there were 100 folks that you served in 2019 and in 2021, you're at 200 people. That delta then is, or let's say you were 100, you budgeted 120. Your actual today is at 180. It would be those extra 60. So that's really why we didn't change anything from last year's program, because we recognize that some people, I mean, good budgeting practices is that you would have had to budget in 2021 for expenses, even if they're COVID related, right? But we're recognizing that's still that was an expense that was outside of your control, and that's what we're trying to help offset here.
Okay, so you're comparing the service levels from 2019 to 2021 then. I thought the slide showed 2019 versus 2020.
You know, Bob, I'll go back and we'll check that and make sure that we don't have an error there. So thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you.
I see there's a question there.
Sheila, there's a question about what funds are not eligible.
What funds are not eligible?
Right, that is the question. So I think it's potentially, Tanya, I think what you mean is what expenses are not eligible?
So types of expenses that are not eligible is if you got a paycheck protection loan, a PPP loan, and that covered your incremental staffing costs between January and March, you couldn't include them, but you might be able to include them from April through July. If you have expenses that you incur all the time, whether the pandemic happened or not, you can't include those. So we do have on the DE Cares Fund site the specific expense categories that would qualify. But again, the key is that they are related to the pandemic. So PPE, expenses that you know, having to purchase additional supplies because like cleaning supplies, if you had to have a contract with the disinfecting, if you had to upgrade your ventilation systems because of the airborne nature of this virus. Those are things that are related to the pandemic that you had to spend. But the key is that if you got a grant to cover that ventilation system, and let's say the ventilation system cost you $20,000 and you got a grant for 15, you can only submit for the 5 that you were not covered. I hope that answers the question. So there's a question that came in. Are you eligible if you received the EIDL grant? Again, eligibility here is around the category of nonprofit and your date of incorporation, and you're operating in the state of Delaware. The key is that any grants that you received, you can't ask to be reimbursed for expenses that you applied those funds towards. Typically that means restricted grants. So if you got restricted monies through contract, a grant that was specific to an expense, you cannot then also get reimbursed through this program. If you got a grant or let's say a donation from a funder or a donor that was just to help you, and you applied that monies towards your utilities, you could then still get reimbursed for COVID-19 expenses. So that's the way to think about it. It's making sure when you were submitting the expenses that you did not get money specifically for those expenses. Let's see. Can the EIDL loan be paid off with funding? No. This funding is only reimbursed. So let me say this. You're getting reimbursed for the expenses that you incurred. What you do with that money when you receive it is your decision, or your board's decision, based upon what you think is best. Other questions?
Yeah, just Sheila, one more question. What is the application is going to be available on Monday? What is the deadline for how long is the application period?
It's the whole month of October. So okay. It's you can actually see the application now, Bob, if you go to the DCF website.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
So it's important to note that the application closes November 1st at noon. So in previous rounds, the application has closed at 5 p.m. and that's caused a little bit of angst. So we did adjust that to be noon just in case there are any, problems, major catastrophes, those kinds of things. Rob, did you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Melissa. So conceivably, we could get reimbursed for a continuation of a staff expense that we applied for and received funds for under the previous round of this, because we had not budgeted for that person in 2019. We incurred that expense. We got reimbursed for the portion that was eligible last round. Could we then put in for that person's wages and benefits for the January to July portion in 2021? Does that make sense?
Yes, and as long as you're able to document that position exists because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and again, you've not been reimbursed or funded through restricted funding for that position in other ways, it seems that you could submit for those costs. I would just be mindful that if you got a Paycheck Protection Program, a PPP loan into 2021, like the round 2 PPP, that you were able to document that you did not apply PPP funds to that position.
Right, that didn't apply for us, but yep, that's a good caveat.
So a question came up of what organizations are not eligible.
I'm sorry, actually, sorry. Sheila, yes, we have somebody else who is next.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So, Ms. Darrow, I know you had a question, you had your hand up.
Yes, so my question is, Sheila mentioned something about utilities, that if we got a donation from a donor, we can, and we didn't get paid, we can use the this funds for that. Is that correct?
When I use utilities, I was using that as an example as it relates to if those were incremental utility expenses because of the pandemic. And if you did not have a donor, let's say, pay for those incremental expenses. So the way to think about it's always, did I incur this expense because of the pandemic? And if I incurred this expense because of the pandemic, did I ask anybody else for funding, or did I get contracted by anyone else for this funding? And if I had to pay for this money on my own, or pay for this expense on my own, then therefore it could be eligible.
Okay.
As long as your organization fits within the criteria. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry, now Kristen.
So Kristen's question was, what organizations are not eligible? And this comes back to if your organization received CARES Act funding in 2021 from another division, such as the Delaware Division of Small Business, that's Arts and Culture, received distribution of funds in 2021 that were CARES Act related. That's why they're not included in this program. Hospitals and higher education are also not eligible because they continue to receive distribution of CARES Act funding, according to what we understand from the state. FOLA. Do you have a question? Rob, do you still have a question, or are you just still have your hand up?
Sorry, I still have my hand up. I don't know how to untake it up.
That's okay. We won't tell.
All right, thanks.
I got you. I got you.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Fola, do you have a question? I'm not hearing.
Okay, do other folks have questions? Oh, Fola, are you okay?
Well, as a reminder, you have till November 1st by noon to submit your application. And we do have folks who can provide assistance and answer your questions along the way. Fola, do you have a question? I see you're unmuted again.
This is Kathleen. No one's answered we got the 10,000 EDIL in the beginning, and I believe it was forgiven. Does that make us not eligible to apply for this?
Kathleen, the EIDL does not prevent you receiving an EIDL loan, whether it's forgiven or not, is not related to this program. The issue is if you got the EIDL loan specifically to help you offset certain expenses, those expenses could not be reimbursed.
Okay, I got it. Okay, now I just wanted clarity. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the deadline is November 1st at noon.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
If for the cleaning services, if we prepaid for the year and the receipt shows that, how do you want us to go about dividing that so that you don't pay for more than July 12th reimbursement? And this is any of co-purple. Thank you.
Hey, that's a great question. I will have to ask the folks at the United Way and the Community Foundation to understand how they're approaching it, but I would assume that they would ask you to prorate it either by the number of days, because it's a January 1 to July 12th. It's not full months. So what we can do is we'll get that answer and we'll put one in the FAQ, and then we'll also send you an email with that answer so that you know.
Yeah, I think in the past, what I would do is just like kind of write on the receipt, the amount that I'm actually asking for, even though it would say more. But thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we will get the answer to that and put it in the FAQs and send you directly that response for your situation. So the application is October 4th to November 1st. The time frame for looking at expenses is January 1st to July 12th.
Why does it cut off on July 12th?
That's the end of the state of emergency. And that's why the state set that date.
Oh, okay.
Again, our hope is that we will be able to promote some program through the ARPA funds, but none of that is finalized. We certainly, Melissa's already had several conversations with the state of Delaware about distribution of ARPA funds. I would encourage you in your local municipalities to reach out to whether it's your council, the mayors, to find out how they're thinking about distributing funds, especially for those towns that received a sizable portion of ARPA funding. Unlike the CARES Act, which just distributed funds to the states and large counties, the ARPA funding went to towns, counties, and the state. And so there could be an opportunity for you to get some support through the ARPA program. And the ARPA program is a little more, it's a little broader in what they cover. They're primarily looking at how they can rebuild communities. And so you may find that the services that you provide align nicely with what the town or the county might be interested in. All right, I have one last call for questions. Well, again, I want to thank you.
I'm sorry, wait, Sheila, hold on. So the cutoff date is November 12th. I just want to make sure that was clear. That was a question.
July.
Oh, sorry. No, the July 12th, July 12th for the expenses. November 1st is the deadline to apply. I'm sorry. I'm caffeinating. I'm sorry.
That's fine. So again, we have decaresfunds.org is the website that has FAQs. We also we have a couple of videos if you want to go through the videos to see how to fill out the application. We are in the process of updating the Part 2 schedule video, so that will be up before October 1st. And again, you know, we're here to help, and we want you all to be successful in your application. So with that, I don't see any other questions. I think then we can all go have another cup of coffee, go for a nice walk. In Bob's case, go back and see the puppies and kittens that Faithful Friends has. And wish you all a great day, everyone.
Thank you.